Good afternoon and welcome to the second of this semester's Psychology Department Speaker Series presentation. I'm Dr. Frank Connor. I am the chair of the Psychology Department. It's always great to see the number of students and community members who attend these events. Today I want to introduce to you today's speaker. As you can see, he's conveniently put much of it up there. This is Thomas Overly. Thomas is the founder of VR Therapy and Counseling Center. He is a practicing therapist. Thomas received his undergraduate degree from Aquinas, his graduate degree from Grand Valley, and like everybody sitting in the, well, not everybody sitting in the room, but most of you sitting in the room, he attended Grand Rapids Community College. So he is an alumnus and shares that with you. So give him your undivided attention and look forward to the presentation.
Great. Is this thing active? Yeah, there we go. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So, as he said, I'm Tom Overly, and I'm going to be talking about the emergent use of virtual reality and in the treatment of psychological disorders today. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here, and I also want to thank Dr. Connor for inviting me. It's truly an honor to be here, and as you can tell, I'm a little nervous. I'm not a natural-born speaker, but I'll get better as I go. So let's start out, and Dr. Connor already mentioned a little bit about my background, but I'm going to give you a little bit more just so you can get a sense for how I ended up using VR eventually and what I'm doing. Yeah, back in the 90s, I had no idea what I was doing. So I just did some general studies here, ended up going back to my family business for the next decade, and finally decided I wanted to get out and do something. And that's when I went to Aquinas, got my Bachelor of Science in Psychology there. And it was there that I became interested in cognitive psychology. And I was pretty research-oriented there. I volunteered there, and it was a really good experience, and while I was there, I also studied computer science. And computer science is something that's been in my life since I was younger. My parents got me an Apple IIe with green vector graphics when I was a kid, and so I've been working with computers, and I'm a gamer. I've been a gamer all my life, so that kind of steered me in this direction. And then when I eventually ended up at Grand Valley, working on my Master of Social Work, it came the time where I had my first research class there. And I was really excited, happy to be there. And the class started up, and we had an adjunct professor. And I've had lots of wonderful, wonderful adjunct professors. And this guy, he was good, but he had no business really teaching a research class. The first week of class, it was us trying to help him understand the difference between an independent and dependent variable. And it was painful. And after that week wrapped up, he started to teach the class by telling us, well, he broke us into 3 groups and said, I want each group to go home, and here's the chapters you're going to read and study. And then next week you're going to come in, and each group is going to present on these chapters. And that was how he taught the class, because he knew nothing about the material. So he used us to teach the class for him. And obviously, we were all a little disgruntled about this. And so I decided at that time that I was going to make it fun somehow for myself. And the class culminated in a research proposal. And so I started reviewing the literature, looking for what was out there, and I thought, you know what? I was interested in VR back in the 90s, and then it fizzled, but I had heard rumblings of the Oculus Rift coming up, so I knew there were things happening out there. So sure enough, when I started looking through the journal articles, I found a considerable amount of articles out there that showed some efficacy with the systems they were using mid-2000s. And so because there was so much out there, I did my research proposal on it. I proposed a new system that was an improvement over what they were using. And eventually, that's when we opened VR Therapy and Counseling Center. That was what we went with. So, let me move here. So, right, and here's the thing. I recommend not doing anything close to what I did after grad school. I did the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do. And I had a reason, though, because I knew part of it had to do with the timing with VR. I knew it was coming. I knew that if I waited my full 2 years with my limited license to get it going, that I could very well miss the ship. And I knew what I wanted to do, so I hired my own supervisor and opened my own practice. And it was painful and costly, and I poured a lot of my own money into it to make it work. But I'm glad I did it that way, because right after we opened, I started seeing clients January of last year, and we immediately started using the VR, and I immediately started getting good results with it. And so after that time, things smoothed out. I ended up hiring a couple of programmers to help me out because I was doing everything at the time, all the programming, all the billing, everything, and I was there 7 days a week. So that's how I got started with VR therapy. And I'll talk a little bit more about Promena, which I just founded a few months ago. That separate corporation is really my attempt to start getting this into the hands of other therapists, other organizations, and I want to make it easier for them than it was for me, because it's not really practical for most organizations to hire programmers to design custom environments for the people they're working with. So we're going to simplify that and make it easy and not too expensive, really. And that was the other part of why I knew this was the time to do it, because back in the 90s, the quality was horrible, and actually I'll get to that right now. Back in the 90s, this was VR, and those headsets, they ran in the tens of thousands of dollars, and only to give you those kind of results on the bottom there. But you know, the thing was, back in the early 90s, like most people, I had grown up on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and they had, I don't know if anyone has ever seen it, The Next Generation, yeah. So they had a concept in there, it was called the holodeck. And they used holograms to create all sorts of simulations, and it was realistic, and they would use it for leisure, for training, anything you could imagine. And so having gone through the 80s with that, when VR popped up, I think everyone was excited, like, oh, we're finally getting close to the holodeck. But as you can see, it wasn't quite there, and then it fizzled, okay? So fast forward to today, and we have headsets like the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, and we have graphics engines like the Unreal Engine 4 here, which is what we use to design all of the programs that we have in-house at VR Therapy. And it's light years ahead, and as you can see, the graphics are near photorealistic now. So you can really create immersive environments with the technology, and it doesn't cost that much. They're still a little overpriced right now. The Oculus, I think, is running $600 without the controllers, and the Vive is about $800. So they still need to come down, but it's nowhere near the tens of thousands that it was in the 90s for poor performance, okay? So here's some of the stuff that I originally found when I was in grad school, and as you can see, this is just a small sampling, and I'm going to give you, at the end of the lecture, there will be a link you can go to and pull up all the original articles that I've compiled over the years, and it includes all of these articles. So what I found when I was going through this literature was that with regard to PTSD, one of the earliest studies, it was done with ground zero workers after 9/11 who had experienced it. Some of them were civilians, some of them firemen, and what they did, they recreated elements of that day And as part of exposure therapy, they exposed them to these things gradually over time. And sure enough, after enough exposures, they habituated and their anxiety was reduced as a result of that exposure. Now, in this study, in most of these studies, what was found was that this approach, using VR as a tool, it actually was, at the very least, as effective as traditional talk therapy. And in some cases was better. And this was, mind you, even back then in 2007, the tech still wasn't there. It wasn't up to speed with what I showed you. It was kind of halfway in between the old stuff and the new stuff, okay? So anyway, they did this. They had similar results with PTSD that was generated from a variety of things. So auto accidents, violent crime victims, and then most of the studies, these early studies, were done with active duty soldiers and veterans. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. And then in the comparative studies, they also found the same results as far as efficacy, at least as good, sometimes better. But the really interesting thing, and this was the thing that really sealed it for me, was that they showed that compared to the talk therapy, when people were using the virtual reality in the treatment process, the patients tended to stay through to the end of the program much more often than those in the talk therapy. They didn't explore all the reasons for that, but I tend to hypothesize because they were doing this with active duty soldiers and veterans. Well, I've worked with some of them, and they're not the kind of guys that like to sit around and talk about their feelings for hours on end, okay? So with the virtual reality exposure element, a lot of what they were doing was physically based. They could get up, go into VR, and face their fears and gradually habituate without having to sit there and spill all their emotions out, okay? So they found that in the meta-analyses, and they found it also with the treatment of phobias. So everything they found was for anxiety spectrum disorders. And all sorts of phobias they worked through, and this was that team. Robert McClay, he's a Navy psychiatrist, and he came up with the original programs. They're basically virtual Iraq and Afghanistan settings, and they would start out, the whole program would be twice a week for 10 weeks. And the session one would be psychoeducational. They'd explain what they were going to be doing over the course of the therapy. And then the second session, they would have them recall the events that they experienced, do some of the emotional processing, figure out exactly what happened, and then they would educate them on what they're going to be doing with the VR. They would teach them relaxation techniques, proper breathing, et cetera, all the things you would traditionally do in therapy. But then they would go to the exposure sessions. And these scenarios would be designed to replicate forms of trauma that these soldiers had been through. And they also had it set up so that as they were going through, they could adjust the intensity of the exposure. So, it's always, you have to be careful you don't want to throw someone in to a scenario that's so traumatic that you end up re-traumatizing them. So they would start out, introduce them to the scenarios, and over time, gradually increase the intensity of the experience. And in their original system, they had visual, olfactory, and tactile feedback. When at our office, we do the same. We have scent delivery systems so that if the client reports that there are elements of their memory that are scent-based, then when they go in VR, we include those scents. We work with a company out of LA that can pretty much design any kind of scent packet. We send request, and they send it out to us within a few days. Let's see here. So I'm going to explain a little bit about exposure therapy itself. It's a type of behavioral therapy, and the way it works in traditional therapy is you have imaginal exposure, where the client basically tells their story, and you request that they kind of hold the imagery in their minds as they're telling their story. And it provides the necessary exposure to keep that habituation going with them, okay? But the problem with that, and I've experienced this myself, is that, excuse me, people's skills in doing that vary wildly, and there's no way to really predict how good someone's going to be at doing that type of thing. We can't jump into their heads and get a sense for how good they are at imagining things as they sit there and talk. And then the other form of exposure we have is in vivo exposure, and that's just facing the actual environments, the actual triggers that bring about the anxiety. And that usually, in traditional therapy, that usually takes the form of homework, where you develop a plan with the client and say, okay, this week I want you to go into this environment that brings about some anxiety and spend a certain amount of time. And with that, again, you start gradually. They might be at a distance from a place or a person or object that brings about the anxiety, and you increase that intensity in the homework over time. But of course, with that, you run the risk of you're dealing with, you don't know what the environment's going to be like for them. You don't know if they're going to back out at the last minute because of the fear response. It's really out of you just have to have faith in the client that they're going to go out and do this kind of exposure appropriately, because there's no way for a lot of the types of triggers that are out there, there's no way you can really recreate that in the office setting so that you're there ready to expose them to whatever they need at any time. So that's where the VR exposure comes in. Because they're there in the office and they actually experience the environment, it's not dependent on their abilities to visualize. They're seeing it. So it's kind of halfway in between the in vivo and the imaginal. But you also get to circumvent the uncontrolled environment. You have complete control at any time over the level of exposure, and you're in communication with the client the entire time they're being exposed to the anxiety-provoking stimuli. So, let's see. This is a really important scale to consider as we go through and I talk about some of these things. The Sud Scale, Subjective Units of Distress, is what we use when we're getting ready to do any kind of exposure related to anxiety disorders. And I like to explain it to my clients as, okay, 0, it's complete lack of anxiety, floating on a cloud, everything's wonderful. And with 100 being, okay, this is the kind of situation where you would feel that you really needed to flee the situation, remove yourself from whatever the stimulus was that's bringing about the anxiety. And so with the scale, what we typically do is we'll develop an anxiety hierarchy so that based on past experiences, sometimes projections of things they will have to face, I'll have them flesh out a complete scale so that not only do we have the stuff, the higher end, more problematic stuff that's really interfering with their lives, but we'll develop a complete representation of the scale. And then when the exposure starts, the idea is you don't start out at the upper end, you start out at the lower end. And you gradually have them habituate to the lower end of their hierarchy. And once they successfully do that, then you just walk your way up the ladder with the exposures, okay? And it works really well. And the goal usually being that, okay, we might not be able to completely extinguish your anxiety, but if we can get the higher end down to where the lower end, was for you, then it's not interfering with your life in any way. And that's really the goal in therapy. It's to get, not completely extinguish anxiety, but to get it to the point where it's not interfering with your life anymore. So we use that, and I also use the Sud Scale when people are actually in VR. So during the exposure, I'll be in constant communication and getting feedback from them as to their level of anxiety as the exposure goes on. So let me talk a little bit about how we do the PTSD treatment with VR. First off, how many of you have used some kind of VR headset? Yeah. How many of those were like mobile headsets? Okay. Well, here's the deal. As we go through this, I'm going to have some photos and a film up here, and I'm going to ask you guys to use your imagination a little bit with this, because you're going to see these two-dimensional images and you're going to think instantly, okay, that looks like a video game. I've seen that a million times. But with VR, it's so much different. It's such a hard thing to put into words. It's one of those things you really need to experience to appreciate. Because you put that headset on, it uses all the motion tracking. So when you look around, you're in that environment. So as I show you pictures, and I'm going to have some of the actual programs that we've designed, just keep in mind that, okay, when you're in VR, you're in that environment completely. You can look anywhere in the environment, and it looks like you're in the environment. And it feels that way, which that's what you get the immersion from. So with PTSD, we usually start out, we do the standard complete psychological evaluation. So we find out about their background, history, anything, family-related stuff, past psych treatments, anything that might play a role in what they're experiencing, so we can better understand how these things are happening and how we're going to go about treating them. And after that initial psychological evaluation, we move on and we do what's called a CAPS-5 assessment. This is this was developed by the military, but they also have a civilian version of it, which is what we use when we're dealing with just civilians. And the way this works, the CAPS-5 refers to the updated DSM-5 standards. So the assessment takes about an hour and has 30 questions, and each question it looks at the intensity and the frequency of the symptom that you're looking at. And if the person meets enough of the criteria, they're grouped into categories, and if they respond that they're having these symptoms in enough of the categories, then it's pretty safe to say that they do have PTSD, and then you can proceed with the treatment. Because sometimes PTSD doesn't happen in that many people. It's like 20% of the people that end up experiencing some form of trauma come down with PTSD. And so it could be that, yeah, they've experienced trauma and it's affecting them in some way, but not necessarily in the form of PTSD. So you want to make sure that that is really what's taking place before you go about treating it. Okay, and then after that initial assessment, I do things a little differently than they did, because what I've found with PTSD is that the prolonged exposure therapy, it is effective. It's one of the most effective modes of treating PTSD out there. And it has a really unfortunate name, though. It sounds like some kind of torture, like you're waterboarding someone. They really need to come up with something different, but that's what we have. But it's not quite as scary as it sounds, because the way that works is we start out, and when we do the CAPS-5 assessment, we have to limit it to basically 3 memories. If there are more, we have to focus on the top 3 intrusive memories that are present in their symptoms, okay? And we usually, how it works with prolonged exposure therapy is we'll start with the worst of the worst in that case. And the way it works, I will ask them, okay, what I need you to do is concentrate as we're going through the story. I want you to try to hold the imagery in your mind's eye as we're discussing it. And they'll start, and we really have to go through the memory frame by frame, like you were going through an old style movie reel. And I usually have to slow people down because one of the hallmarks of PTSD is avoidance. So the natural inclination is just to skip over and get through it as quickly as possible. But that's not providing them with the exposure they need to habituate to the memory itself. And I explain, we're not trying to make the original trauma acceptable or okay in any way. We're dealing with the memory itself, which is part of your brain, and we want you to have mastery over that memory, okay? So we start walking through, and I ask questions as we're going through. I make sure that they go into great detail about every element of the memory as they're explaining it to me. And you'll find that when PTSD is happening and they have these memories that are in there, they can recall pretty much every last detail of the environment, anything that was present, any sense, anything at all, they can immediately describe it to you, okay? It's because those memories just get burned into the brain. The chemical cocktail that's going on when you experience trauma creates memories that are very different from just our standard bad memories that aren't intrusive, aren't pushing back at us. And part of the goal in exposure therapy is to shift those kind of memories over into that bad memory category where, yeah, this bad thing happened, but it doesn't have to have power over you the way it is when you are encountering PTSD. So we start that. I'll have them describe things like, okay, what color is the carpeting? What do the walls look like? What's on the walls? And they'll go, and part of the reason I do that is because you want to make sure that they're keeping that imagery in their minds as you're in the safe environment, you know, and with PTSD and when we're working with kids with PTSD, the very first question we ask is, okay, are you, with the environment you're in at your home right now, is it a safe environment, especially with kids? And sometimes parents don't understand that, hey, even if there's lots of yelling going on, if the kid's going home to that environment, doing this kind of work is going to be really hard. It's going to be hard for them to recover. So first you have to establish that they're in a safe environment, and they need to be able to experience these memories in safety and feel safe while they hold these memories in their minds. So where the VR comes in, where the way I do things is typically when PTSD is occurring, there will be generalization that occurs where there will be things that a person encounters in their everyday environment that can trigger the anxiety reaction. And it could be just types of people that look similar to those that were present in the original trauma. It can be places, and that's where the VR comes in when I'm treating people. We'll make sure that they can face those things, and we expose them enough times so that the anxiety reaction gradually comes down until they can go out in their real lives and go into these same situations without that kind of reaction. Now, I'm going to get into some of the cases I've actually worked with and describe some of the variants we've had using VR with some individuals. One of the earliest cases I had, he was a combat veteran, a former Marine, and he had witnessed all the things you hear about war. He had seen them all. He had been in a camp that had come under attack. There were mortars going off. He saw a young girl, like a 6-year-old girl, get run over when people were fleeing a situation. He was in a Humvee that overturned in and some kind of basin, and he was trapped in there. He had been through it all, and his CAP score was through the roof. His symptoms were extreme. And again, we started with him, did the standard prolonged exposure therapy where he told his story. We did that for several months on a weekly basis until once you start that process with prolonged exposure therapy, the other important thing that you do with that is you monitor, you get feedback from the client constantly with regard to their symptoms, frequency, severity. And almost always you can see that gradual decline as it occurs. And it's a really gratifying thing to see as a therapist, because even hearing these things for a therapist can be really traumatic itself. When I was going through grad school, they talked quite often about secondary trauma, and I kind of brushed it off like that's not going to happen to me. There's no way. And lo and behold, last year I was working with another Marine, and it was shortly before Christmas, and before you know it, I was just in a foul mood, and I wasn't sleeping well. I was really, really irritable, and I had the memory that he had described to me in an excruciating detail replaying in my head. And it was at a time where I was seeing multiple trauma victims. And so I was just worn down, working a lot, and I ended up having to talk with our child therapist so I could work through some of that and get better. It didn't take me long, but it was happening, and it's a real thing. So with him, after we did the prolonged exposure therapy portion, he, like you see with a lot of combat veterans, would have anxiety reactions to loud noises, especially, you've probably heard people talking about it this past 4th of July. Oh, I'm getting a foot cramp. So this past 4th of July, there were quite a few news stories out there about, hey, veterans have a really hard time with this holiday. Can you go easy on them? Well, after we finished the exposure therapy and his symptoms had reduced significantly, then we designed a scenario that was similar to the base he had been on when that mortar attack happened. And I set it up so that he could walk around this base, and there were mortars going off, lots of explosions. And we started out, with the minimal, and then we gradually increased it. I monitored him. When we're doing this, we always, besides the feedback that we get with the Sud Scale, I also have a pulse oximeter hooked up so I get another measure of any potential anxiety levels. Because if they're having a severe reaction, obviously their heart rate is going to go up. And so I keep that going just as another measure of that. And he did really well. It took only a few sessions, a few hour-long sessions, until his anxiety came down to a level where it wasn't that bothersome to him. Now, on the other side of things, I would say most of the people I treat for PTSD have actually experienced some form of sexual assault. And you might wonder, okay, what are you going to do in VR with that? Well, no, obviously we don't put them in a situation where they feel like they're being attacked again. But again, you find that the situations, there are things present that they end up generalizing into their everyday life. And with one of my early clients in this area, it was probably the most challenging case I've had so far, because not only did she have PTSD, but she had a learning disorder. And so that, I had never really dealt with that before. So we had to really slow down. I had to make sure that, as far as especially the psychoeducation piece, that she understood everything we were doing, why we were doing it, and that she was okay with doing it. And in her case, she had been assaulted numerous times as a child by multiple relatives, and then also as an adult was in multiple abusive relationships, horrible physical brutality, and so she was having all sorts of things going on. And the photo here I'm showing you on the bottom was from a scenario we created that it looks pretty standard. This was the closest we've ever come to where, okay, we probably could have just gone into a room and done the same thing, but again, this was a more controlled way of doing it. And we set up this door, and it has, you can't see it well in here, but there's a silhouette behind it. And what was happening with this woman was that anytime she would hear a deadbolt go, she was having a severe anxious reaction to it. And that was because the original perpetrators, when she was an adult, would assault her and then lock her in a room where you couldn't, it was lockable from outside. And he did this repeatedly with her. And so we set this up, and she walked around in this room, and I could trigger the door lock as often as possible. And again, with her, I was always in complete communication, making sure she was okay, monitoring her SUDS report. And again, with her though, we had multiple scenarios like this where she was generalizing in all sorts of ways. For instance, and this is another common thing you encounter in PTSD, especially with people who experience trauma at a young age, that they will take that traumatic memory, and because one of the symptoms that can come about in PTSD is frequent nightmares that are so disruptive that you wake up and you get, some of these people are getting only a few hours of sleep a night because they can't sleep without these disruptive nightmares occurring. And when people are having nightmares like that, based on their trauma over years and years, what happens is they'll add elements to the original memory, and they can morph in all sorts of really unique ways, but they're all usually pretty terrifying ways. And in this woman's case, she had a scenario like this based on when she was a youth in Detroit, and she experienced some horrible things. And so it had gotten to the point where she would walk out to the mailbox and feel that same thing from her nightmare was happening as she was going out to her mailbox. She was scared to even leave her house because she would start experiencing these things. So we set up a simulation that had elements that she had described from her nightmare. And again, she had control of her movement in the scenario. She could get as close or as far from the anxiety-provoking stimuli as she was comfortable with. And so we worked through several scenarios like that, gradually reduced that reaction, and the symptoms stopped. And that woman was kind enough, she was recently on NPR with me. There's a link on all of our social media sites where you can hear more and hear that whole story from her. Now, this has been the other major part where VR has been so incredibly effective. And with specific phobias, we actually use it more than we do with PTSD because it is much more straightforward. People have environments, situations, objects that bring about anxiety. It's disrupting their lives. So our goal is to gradually expose them to those things until they habituate. And we do this the same way. We start out with the psychological evaluation, and I have them build up that anxiety hierarchy. And even as they're doing that, I'll throw out to them like, okay, if they describe a certain situation, I'll put some kind of spin on it. Like, okay, would you feel worse if it were all men in that environment, or worse if you were exposed with bad weather conditions, all sorts of things. So I'll make sure we get a complete picture of the environments and the situations that are bringing about the anxiety. And then again, we start out with the gradual exposure in VR. And we start on the low end and we work our way up. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the specific phobias we've worked with since we've been open. Again, one of the earliest clients I had, he came in with illness anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. And the illness anxiety disorder was the most disruptive thing at the time. So we worked through that first with traditional therapy, got him better with that, and then it was time to deal with the social anxiety. And for that, he had stated that because of his job and where he wanted to go, he had to do lots of presentations in front of people dressed in, this is my only suit, by the way, so. But people dressed like this, and he described all the elements of that, their characteristics, age, and that was one of the first programs that I built on my own before we had programmers working there, and I was using the Unity engine at the time, which we've since gotten rid of and opted for the Unreal Engine 4 because it just provides better graphics out the door and we don't have to tinker with it quite as much. And so I set up this environment, populated it with the exact kinds of people that he had expressed he would be dealing with, and I set it up so that I could trigger any kind of behaviors that would typically be disruptive in a presentation setting. And I sat them around this boardroom table, and so, for instance, I could have someone's cell phone go off. I'd have people that would nod off, ask them questions, start whispering to other people. Anything that you've ever had go wrong in a presentation, I could trigger for him. And I would have him go into VR and give speeches to these people. And with the characters I use in the environment, I could specify even how often they would look in his eye. I could change the frequency of that. And so he'd be in there, and as we worked through the exposure over multiple sessions, I would have people staring intently at him. I would adjust their positions and the actual player so it wasn't him just repeating the same exposure over and over again. So over time, he got better and he felt confident. He expressed to me like, I'm ready to do this. I can go and do this, the real thing. And that's how successful that was. Flight anxiety is another big one we've worked with. And what I've done for that is we have, I put together a seat that has basically a subwoofer in it, and it's designed in a similar fashion to those you find on airplanes. And I'll go with the example, we had a woman come in late last year. It was only a couple months before Christmas, and she had extreme flight anxiety, and her goal was they had set up a Christmas Day flight, and she felt there was no way she could do it. She had backed out of flights before, and that was our goal, to get her ready by Christmas. So we started out with her, found out her anxiety hierarchy, and we started out with just smooth flights in the daytime, and we adjusted those conditions over time until she was flying in storms, flying with high turbulence, and after 2 months, she had her last virtual flight 2 days before Christmas, and after Christmas, we got an email from her, and she had a picture of her with her kids, and she was telling us how she actually helped someone else on the flight who had flight anxiety, and it was one of our proudest stories. And but I've worked with other people with flight anxiety. I had a gentleman who had to fly a lot for business, and every time he would fly, he would become so anxious that he ended up vomiting. And we used the same process with him. And with him, he found that whenever we would do turns with the plane, it would create a lot of anxiety. So eventually we got to the point where we were flying it all over the place. And he habituated to that, and same deal with him. We stayed in communication. His first flight that he went on, didn't get nauseous. He made it through. And after that first flight, he came back in. He was like, well, I want to do a couple of refreshers just to make sure this is real. And so we put him through some more extreme flights. And since then, he's been flying just fine and has not gotten sick on any flights. So we had another success story there. Acrophobia, fear of heights, that's another one. This photo here is from the actual program we designed. And as you can tell, no one's going to actually walk on a trail like that, but because there is that when people are in VR, they know obviously they're not going to get hurt. So what I found is when we're exposing people, especially with phobias, that we crank it up to 11 a little bit sometimes, so that when they eventually get to that point where they're dealing with the most extreme situations, they can habituate to those, even though they're not realistic as far as no one's going to walk across. I would hope not. But with this gentleman, when he came in, he presented to us, okay, well, I want to, he was an older man, and he had on his bucket list, he wanted to go on this trip with his wife to a canyon, and he brought us in pictures of that canyon, and we basically recreated that trail with some more perilous parts to it. And when he started out, when he described anxiety he had had in similar situations before, his SUDs would average around a 70, which is pretty high, 70 to 80. And when he first entered this environment, and he only got up to an area that was about 30 feet off the ground, he was already reporting that same rating. So early on with him, he would just go up a little ways, and I would say, okay, don't go past that. If this is enough to create that much anxiety, I want you to just stay right there, take in the sight, look around, and maybe go back down a little bit. So I found that he would go down the trail, come back up to that same point, and go back. And then with each session, he would go a little bit higher up the trail. And we did that over a couple months, and he eventually got to the point where he went all the way to the top, and it's pretty high up there. And he stood around at the top for a while. Next session, he came in, and he went up to the top quite quickly, and then for him, going down was even more anxiety-provoking. And he had given me a story about an earlier experience where he literally ran down a trail once because his anxiety was so high. So he started going up and then going down very, very slowly. He was moving a couple feet every like 1 minute. But eventually he got to the point where he could traverse the trail at a normal walking speed and then go right back down, and he would do that a couple times in a session. And then he was good to go, and he went on his trip. Now, what I want to talk about is some of the current studies that are being done, because this kind of stuff is what I'm really excited about. And I'll get more into my stuff after this one, but this study was done earlier this year at the University College of London. And I had never, when I was doing all that original research, I had never found anything related to depression in VR. So I've never used VR to treat depression in any way, shape, or form. And what they did with this study was they placed a person who was suffering from depression in a room, in a virtual room, with a distraught child. And the client in this case is the person with the motion tracking suit on. And what they did was they had her comfort that child to the point where she stopped crying and she was no longer distraught. But as she was comforting that child, they recorded the motion movement from this person. And I think in this study, it was a small sample size. They had 15 people involved in this, and this was done in February, I believe. And so after the depressed person comforts the child, what they do is they switched the perspective so that now the client was in the body of the child. And then they took the avatar that represented the original client and played back everything that client had done to comfort the child. So it was the person comforting themselves as a child. And with the idea being, okay, learn better self-compassion. And they found that in doing this, with these 1 month of 8-minute scenarios, half of the participants reported a reduction in depressive symptoms, and 1/4 reported clinically significant drop in depression severity. So they were good results, but it's a single study. They're getting ready to do a larger scale study of this sometime this year, I believe still. And that brings us to what I've been working on. What happened here was because only about 1/4 of the clients I saw last year and up until now were coming in with anxiety spectrum disorders, I felt like, okay, there has to be something else we can do in some of these other areas with VR. But I wasn't about to go with anything that wasn't evidence-based. So what happened was I was in a session, and this person happened to be another therapist. And he was an older gentleman, and he had all sorts of problems throughout his life interacting with middle-aged female office executives. It had cost him a couple jobs, and it really, disrupted his career. And so we got to the portion of therapy where what we traditionally do is we'll have role plays within the sessions themselves. And if you ever get into the point where you're in grad school for any kind of counseling, therapy, you're going to find yourselves doing lots of role plays, which I always hated. But that's what you have to do in therapy as well, because that's all we have. And the other part of that is similar to the in vivo I talked about earlier, was it's behavioral homework, where you will work on communication skills and encourage the person to use some of those the next time they encounter a problematic situation that they've been describing and having difficulties with. But that can take a long time, because then you're relying on, okay, well, I guess we're going to have to hope that he gets into another situation like this in the future. But we got to the part of therapy where we were going to do some role plays there in session. And he turned to me and he just looked at me and he's like, "Tom, I can't do this with you. I can't sit here and pretend you're a middle-aged female woman, And so, okay, we don't have to do this. It's okay." And but that's when the light bulb went off above my head. And I was like, okay, we're using all this VR for all this wonderful stuff. There has to be a way to do this. And my first thought was, okay, maybe we could have characters that were AI-driven, and I could set up specific interactions with him. But then you lose the emotional response. So, you know, you don't know what they're going to say, so you can't set up the AI to do every last thing that would be appropriate, or you know, so you can't really do that with AI at this point. Someday we will, but not now. So the next thing I turned to in my head was, okay, I need to somehow get into VR with my clients so that I can take over some of these characters. And so I looked into some of the hardware that was out there, and some of the first stuff I looked at for the body tracking, it was just the stuff they have out in Hollywood that was like started at 20 to 30 grand. I was like, okay, nope, I can't do this. And it just wasn't practical. And that only got the body movement on top of it. So I looked into some of the VR-related Kickstarters out there because gaming is so big, they want solutions out there that are going to address things like body movement. And you know, with the Vive, you have the hand controllers, and those are completely tracked, so you can see your hands in there. But we needed everything going. So I found a body tracking suit that was only about $1,000, funded the Kickstarter, and it got to us just before December of last year when I was trying to put this system together. So we got one of the first issuing of that set. And then we added on, that's one of my programmers there, and he has a head-mounted GoPro. And what it does is track all your facial movement, the very fine movement. You can see it's doing a pretty good job of recreating what he's doing there. And then in addition to that, we use voice modulation. So now I ended up proposing this system for, Comcast had this Innovations for Entrepreneurs. And I wrote an essay about the system and what we had going so far. And we won the regional portion of the contest, and then that put us in the running for the national version, and then we won that, and they gave me a bunch of money and flew us out to Philadelphia and helped us figure out what we were going to do with this thing. Because from the beginning with this, it wasn't just about what I wanted to do in therapy for clients. I wanted to be able to get this kind of technology out there to other people because, like I said, it's not practical to do what I'm doing. The first year and a half of this was not profitable at all for me. I have to pay these programmers quite a bit of money, and we take Medicaid and Medicare. We don't get paid a lot of money, so I had to fund all this out of private reserves and pretty much depleted my bank account to do it. But it was worth it because now we're at a point where we can start getting this system out to other people, and it's not going to be that expensive. And so in the essay I wrote for that Comcast contest, I gave the example of, let's say you're working with a teenage girl who's having all sorts of behavioral issues in school. And she has faced all sorts of disciplinary stuff, problems interacting with peers. Well, now with the system, what I can do is design a school similar to the one that she goes to, populate it with kids similar to the ones she goes to school with, teachers, etc. Then we can place her in VR, and with this system, I can go into VR, inhabit the body of any of the players in that simulation, and then I can recreate the exact kind of scenarios that she's been having difficulty with. So I can get in there, get things going, see how she reacts, pause the program and say, okay, wait, let's try using some of those communication skills we talked about and do this in a different way. And we can keep doing that, whereas if I had given her homework to do that, I would have to wait another week for her to come back and tell me how that one instance went that she was able to do, and then it spreads it out. So we're looking at being able to make things much more efficient and effective by using a system like this, because then I can hop into multiple kids in there. When I hop out, AI takes over and just does some of the random movements that you find when people are just sitting around. But I can become a teacher, and it changes my voice to match the character, and it tracks all my facial and body movements, so I can fully emote with the person, and they get that emotional response that's so important in doing behavioral work. So what I have here is just a quick 1-minute video that shows off the system, and even the state of the system in this video, we've improved substantially, the character model and everything. It looks beautiful now, but this is what we had when we made the video. Oh, and that just hopped me right out of there. Promena VR's behavioral rehearsal system enables clinicians to conduct customized behavioral therapy to meet the specific needs of patients. The environmental limitations of visualization, role plays, and behavioral homework are eliminated by immersing patients in virtual environments with a fully customized population. The clinician is able to take real-time control of each individual in this population, with all facial movement, speech, and body language being mapped to the specified character. With direct facial mapping and the use of voice modulation, the clinician is able to present to their patients as an individual of any race, gender, or age within scenarios designed to simulate the challenges their patients are facing. The intuitive interface quickly enables natural and realistic interaction with patients. The system enhances the efficacy of a clinician's therapeutic style and does not require new therapeutic techniques to be effective. With Promena VR's behavioral rehearsal system, clinicians are enabled to provide efficient and effective behavioral therapy with a powerful technology whose clinical applications are just beginning to be realized. Okay, and so this is the link I was telling you about. If you want to go here, you can find all those original research articles, and I think I'm going to try updating it as well with stuff from like the last 6 months, because I've been so busy I haven't had a chance to, but I'll get that stuff up there too. But everything we talked about in here is up at that link.
Thank Mr. Overly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.